Hello, welcome to Being Techie. In this session, I'm going to explain ASP.NET Core OWIN Middleware. Essentially, I'm going to demo how to write a custom middleware component in ASP.NET Core. As we all know, OWIN is the concept which decouples or a specification which decouples web applications from web servers. And the middleware is a collection of components which processes requests and provides a response. In the earlier versions of ASP.NET, we used to have a Katana implementation of OWIN. So Katana is a set of assemblies which we used to refer in our solution, and it used to have a abstract class called OWIN Middleware. So any custom middleware component must implement this class and also provide an implementation to some of the base class methods. Coming to the ASP.NET Core, this has been changed. Here, any class with a constructor having a parameter, a delegate called request delegate, and a public method called invoke which accepts HTTP context can be used as a middleware component. This this defines a middleware component, and additionally we can create one extension method which is just a convenience to add this component into the actual middleware request pipeline. In the demo, I'll write one custom middleware component which intercepts each request and reads a query with string parameter called culture. And if there is a value, it reads that culture and sets the culture of the current thread. So anything being displayed which is culture sensitive, like date times or different like numeric formats, will use that culture and display accordingly. So let's jump into the actual demo. I've already created this sample. Let's see how the sample currently looks like. It's getting loaded. See, this is a default web ASP.NET Core web application. I modified the home page to display this banner and the current date time plus the current culture. So by default, it is an English United States culture and the current time is being displayed. Now let's get into the actual code and start writing the middleware component. Just before that, by default, ASP.NET Core template creates this middleware pipeline. If you see, all these are predefined middleware components, static files. In fact, even use MVC is one of the middleware components. So the one we are going to write will be part of these components. Probably we'll be adding one component here. Let's say culture middleware component. Let's add a new class. Probably it should go under infrastructure. Class. It's just a plain class. Let's name it as culture middleware. It is just a convention so that anyone looking at this class understand that this is a middleware component. Let's add a constructor. As I mentioned in during the presentation, this should accept a parameter of type request delegate. It seems to be a keyword. So let's say probably we should add it as a next because this represents the next middleware in the pipeline. And let's include the usings, appropriate usings. And let's define a local request delegate, rather instance level request delegate. This can be a private request, or let's say next underscore next. Initialize the instance variable next. And the next thing we need to define is a method called invoke. Invoke, and which accepts a parameter HTTP context. The context provides all the required information to this middleware. For example, the request headers, request body, all the query string parameters, and we are looking specifically for a request query string parameters. String culture, read it from the request headers, or rather query string. It will be in the query itself. And the parameter we want to define it as culture. Let's check if it really exists, or we can directly create the culture info class. Culture info exists in system globalization. Culture info, and pass the parameter we got it from the query string. This created a new culture info based on the query parameter. Let's assign this to the current culture. At the end, it is the responsibility of this middleware component to call the next one by passing the context. If we don't do this, our MVC middleware component won't get called. So this is a mandatory thing. Another thing I mentioned in the presentation was defining an extension method. This is for pure convenience. So let's define a public static class which will hold all the extension methods related to this middleware component. Culture middleware extensions, and define a, I guess we missed one more brace, and define a static method, public static, which returns a application builder. Let's say use culture middleware. Define this, which is appropriate or good for readability. Since this is an extension method, it should accept the parameter of type this application builder. Let's say app builder. Our middleware doesn't take any parameters, so the extension method parameter is enough. Now call the app builder. Let's say return app builder dot use middleware. Here pass our custom middleware called culture middleware. That's all. Our middleware is ready to use. Let's go back to the startup where we have the middleware pipeline. Remember, initially we made a comment, the place where we are going to add the culture middleware. Since it is defined as an extension method on application builder, we should be able to see the culture middleware. I think we need appropriate namespace. Let's add this. Now the custom middleware is added to the pipeline. Let's run the program now. We got an exception. So since we did not specify any culture parameter, but still our component is going ahead and creating a culture info class with an empty name, so which is throwing an exception. Let's fix that as well. Come out of debug mode, go to the culture middleware. So create and set this culture only if the culture parameter is not null. Culture parameter, when it is not null, do this. Otherwise, let the request go as it is. Run it again. Alright, at least this time we don't see any exception because we have put an if condition. And since we did not specify any culture, it took default a thread culture, which is a en-us, which is a US culture info, and it is displaying the date time in that format. Let's provide the culture GB, which is a Great Britain culture. Here we go. Now the culture info is English, United Kingdom, and you see the difference between the time format being displayed. We have specified the culture, the current culture to be the one which is being passed in the query parameter. And when you look at the index.html, we are saying simply datetime.now.toString. The toString takes the current thread culture and formats the datetime in the appropriate format. So that's the reason we are seeing a different value this time. We can even further customize or expand this culture middleware. For example, by default, there is no culture specified. If you don't specify anything, it is taking the thread's default culture info. We can modify our middleware component so that explicitly we can specify what is the default culture if nothing is specified in the query parameter. In general, all middleware components follow a certain pattern, so any extra parameters to be provided to the middleware component should be passed as an options class. So for this example, it could be called culture middleware options. So let's define a new class called culture middleware options. This is just a convention. There is no need, no like mandatory thing that it should be called options class. But if you look at any middleware, like predefined Microsoft middleware components, they all follow this pattern. culture middleware options. And the option we are going to define for this example, it will be a simple one called default culture. Culture info. Again, add the appropriate namespace. Default culture. Let's modify the extension method because we should be able to pass our options class to the extension method. Go back to the culture middleware class, add a new extension method which accepts the options class. Application builder, same name again, use culture middleware, extension parameter, app builder. This time you have a new class called options. Let's use this here. Pass the options. In the original method, let's call the other overloaded method. Call the default options class. We need to instantiate the property. We can put any culture. Let's use GB, Great Britain, so that we can differentiate it is different from the US culture. I believe we missed one of them. I think we should call this from the app builder, correct. Builder dot use customer where they should fix our error. Yep, this has fixed it. All right, now go back to the culture middleware and take the option class as a parameter. Options. Keep it an instance variable. Assign it inside the constructor. Now we have the default options passed inside our middleware component. Let's use them whenever the culture info is not passed, that is, whenever the if condition is not satisfied. You're going back to your default culture info. Dot current culture equal to options dot default culture. So whenever we don't pass the culture query string parameter, it takes the default one, which is a Great Britain culture. Now go back to our startup class and let's pass the options. Remember, we have defined two extension methods, one with options, the other one without options. Let's use the one with options. Culture options. Default culture, new culture info. We can remove this globalization so that it can be added into the namespace. And the culture name. We can again specify the Great Britain one. Let's run it again. Now the default culture is a Great Britain. See, I didn't specify any culture, but because we have specified the en-gb in options class while we while we defined our custom middleware component in the pipeline. Now let's specify it as US. Boom, we got it US. French, France. So this is a demonstration of how a custom middleware component is written, how their extension methods are added, how the extra parameters are passed to the middleware component using the options class. The code base of this sample is available in the GitHub repository. The link is mentioned in the description below this video. Hope you liked it. Please do subscribe to the channel. Thank you. See you next time.